Right, so anthropology is also considered holistic, and we use what's called holism. And this is the idea that it is kind of all encompassing. So if you think about the four subfields, we're talking about language, we're talking about the artifacts that we make, we're talking about our DNA, and we're talking about the way we behave and interact in culture. So that's why anthropology is considered a holistic field. Even those people who end up focusing on archaeology, they're most of the time, in general, their PhD will say anthropology because it is one of the subfields. The other thing about if we look at holism in terms of just cultural anthropology, we are really talking about how we are going to study everything about the people. We are not going to just go in. Let's say that my focus is religion or syncretism with the Maya that live in the Yucatan, who are still there, by the way. There are 1.1 million Yucatec Mayan speakers. So the idea that the Mayan had just all died off is not true. Their civilization stopped working, and they went back to their farming and their small way of life, or smaller scale way of life, sorry, like villages. Um, anyway, I'm not going to just focus on religion. I'm going to focus on everything about the culture, from the food that they eat to the way that they interact. My main focus might be religion, but I have to give a holistic kind of overview of what that culture looks like in order to put their religious um, beliefs and syncretism into context. Okay, so again, everything human is included. When doing research, the anthropologist must look at every aspect of culture, okay, which is what I was just kind of talking about. And again, that the biological, cultural, and environmental feedback loop, always be aware of that process, right? So let's talk about the Mayan civilization and the fall of their actual civilization. Now remember, for thousands of years, the Mayans were building large monumental architecture, okay? Um, for unfortunately, my example, I mean, I should be using the Inca since this is at Machu Picchu. Um, but for the Mayan, their kind of fall, their empire fall, happened around famine and climate change in kind of the Middle Ages time period. So we're talking about 1000, 1100 up through kind of 14, 1500. And what we saw was the Mayan people abandoning civilization. Now, again, let's go back to our basic needs. If a civilization or a society stops providing basic needs like food, are you going to believe in that society and structure anymore? Right? It's a basic level question, but if we are signing up for things like paying taxes and those kinds of things, and then suddenly none of what we're paying for is working for us, and we are starting to starve to death, and we are seeing our loved ones and community members starve to death, we will not believe in that system. Our belief is based on the needs that it is providing for us. And this feedback loop, this is how it played in, right? So if, again, climate changes, that's the environment, okay? Now let's say that the biological effect of that is now we don't have enough food to feed ourselves, okay? Well, the cultural response has to be either we just keep doing this and we perish, or I'm able to grow enough corn, beans, and squash on my own farm to support myself. I just can't do enough to support an empire and pay for division of labor. Now remember, when we get into civilization, so-called civilization, we'll get into that discussion as well down the road, you're really paying for other people to do other work, right? So the farmers now have to make enough food to support a standing army. Those army, or those individuals in the army, are not going to be planting food. So if they cannot support that activity, now you go back to self-sufficiency, right? Now I have to protect my property, but I can make enough food for me and my family, and maybe even the smaller community or village at hand. That's a cultural feedback loop. Now, that's going to have environmental effects as well. The jungle will start growing back in. You're not going to have clear-cut swaths of land. You're going to have way less disease. Less disease means another biological feedback. The people become stronger, healthier. So this is that feedback loop that I'm talking about. The problem with studying peoples and cultures is bias. We all have bias. It's kind of the in-group mentality. We're raised to believe that we are right or our parents are right, and that gets passed on to us, this traditional idea. And that becomes kind of this protection of self as well. Now, what is bias, right? What is it? Okay? Who has it? Who teaches it? Why do we have them? Do they serve a purpose? Okay? Can we get rid of our biases? Can we completely remove them? And what happens when we do? Okay? So in anthropology, this is an important term. Ethnocentrism is the idea of judging others with your own personal cultural bias at hand. So if I'm looking at this picture, this is a lady in Thailand. If I'm looking at this picture, she's basically selling bugs. If I'm using my own American cultural bias, I say, ew, gross, not touching it, right? That's a judgment, okay? Or saying things like, they talk funny, or the food smells bad, or they have a weird church, or they wear weird clothes. These are all value judgment terms that we use, and it's not good anthropology. To be honest, this is the old days of anthropology. Morgan used some ethnocentrism, wasn't aware of the term necessarily, but used it when he did his own kind of judging on different groups of people, calling people savages and barbers and whatnot, and only because they didn't have so-called civilization. So ethnocentrism is, again, judgment within and comparisons, right? So if you make judgment based on your own personal upbringing, and remember, we didn't have a choice of who we're born to, so we got to get rid of all of that. So in anthropology, the goal is to move more towards cultural relativity. Whereas, instead of me saying, ew, gross is American, you better bet your bottom dollar that I ate a lot of those bugs. I don't have food taboos when I travel, okay? In America, I obviously have food restrictions, like it seems like everybody else these days, okay? But when I travel, culturally sensitive behavior is the goal of an anthropologist. Understanding that bias is a cultural construct, right? Like everything that we're brought up to believe, like not eating dog and cat or bugs, these are all things that have been ingrained in us from the larger macroculture or subculture or even our microculture, our family, and I'll talk about those divisions in a second. We need to be able to put our own biases in their place, okay? Checking them, basically. When you show up to another country, I always just check. There's no comparison. I don't need to make a comparison about why in Panama they do certain things or they eat certain foods when in America they do it a different way. Culture is different. That's the beauty of it, right? Relating to cultural elements in a relative way, right? Like, so the eating a whole fried fish and people eat bones and brain and head and everything. Putting that in its place, like, what is the value of that? Well, maybe it's giving us some nutrient like calcium, right? That we're not lacking maybe here, but in terms of other countries, maybe they don't eat as many fortified dairy products. So there's usually a function or a reason behind these things. Comparing and relating to another culture as long as there is no value judgment, right? So I can analyze another culture, but for me, it's always about symbolic kind of function, right? So if I go there, again, what is the function of what they're doing? Okay, and this is kind of how I break things down. Instead of saying, oh, why do they do that? Or they should do this because this is what we do. I say, I have to analyze enough to the point where I say, oh, this is why they do these things, right? There's always a reason. And truth and reality are cultural constructs. Sorry to burst your bubble, but if you show up to another location, they're not going to think the same way as you, right? They're not going to believe the same way as you. So this is an important piece of the bias structure as well. There's no universal truth or universal right or wrong. These are binary things that our Western tradition teaches us. We are on a spectrum of humanity, and that spectrum continues to grow in terms of what we accept as right and wrong and truth. And also, it grows because we're exposed to new people, right? And if we go and visit some other culture in some far-off place, they're going to stretch that inside of ourselves. And again, that internal dialectic comes back. What is myself? I'm exposed to these new ideas. Maybe there is no. Those things are tough. Cultural anthropologists live in the world of gray area. Okay. So going back to the micro, sub, and macro culture, I wanted to touch on these a bit. Your microculture, think of it as your family or a small religious group, or even a classroom. Okay, or like our online class, we're going to form a microculture. The more that we're exposed to each other and we discuss and we have contact, there's going to be a microculture that forms in this course, and that's perfectly normal. It's based on trust. It's based on shared understanding. And again, this is a micro level. I like to use the frame of a family, like a nuclear family, and think of the different roles that we play in that family. Again, between mom, dad, maybe grandma lives with you, aunts, uncles, whatever that looks like. Children, what roles do they play? I mean, but really it's the most time spent with that group, the most impact on your life in terms of time is your microculture. A lot of times in America, our family is our microculture until we get into that kind of middle school, high school age group. And then our close friends become our microculture and the people that we trust and who we want to spend the most time with. That starts to switch out when we start to form our own families, and create our own microculture. The next level, so think micro, family, most impact, then kind of friends, it switches out. The next level is your subculture, right? And this could be a larger group sharing values. I like to use kind of regions or towns, even cities, village, right? So people use the same language. They might even use the same symbols. They might dress similarly. They probably talk very similarly. They might have the same slang. This is that sociolinguistics piece. And a lot of times in America, we break these down into like ethnic groups, right? A group within a society that maintains their subculture or religion. So individuals who are coming here as refugees from Sudan are going to have that subculture of maybe religious ideas and how they thought and behave, and then they're going to come together during certain holidays or celebrations. But again, in general, most of the time they're spent in that microculture, and then they might blend with this other culture. I like to use kind of California as an example. California is in that place where it's almost too big to be a subculture, but it does have subculture personality traits almost. But again, Californians kind of get lumped into this one group, right, where we're all from LA or we're all from the Silicon Valley. But it's very diverse. And then we could say that there's kind of subcultures within that, right? If we say SoCal, NorCal, if we say the valley, right, or the desert, we have all of these different kind of regions and locations that kind of break down our subcultures. But again, very kind of unique. I mean, a lot of people will kind of judge and say, oh, well, you're Californian, right? And they're basically doing a judgment play on this subculture piece. The macroculture level is the larger kind of cultural group, and I've got a flag here at the stock exchange in New York. And again, the United States is a macroculture. We all have symbols that connect us, right? I have had very little exposure to anybody in Kansas, okay? It's not because I don't like Kansas, I just don't get to Kansas much. But if I went there and I shared our macrocultural symbols, like the flag or like the eagle or some of these other things, we would be able to relate and talk to each other. And it's around this macroculture level, right? We're going to be brought up very differently in micro level and very different subculture. But macro level, we can kind of think and share things, right? It's share even less in common, but we share common symbols, languages, and values. So in terms of anthropology, we're looking obviously now in a more global age at a global culture. And I think that this is kind of the next stage. To be honest, Einstein wrote a book on essays of kind of how people should behave. He kind of gets outside of his physics kind of realm. And he believes kind of in this global culture idea. Ultimately, that we're all humans. We all have those basic needs. We might address those needs differently, but we all have to deal with the issue of these basic needs and the so-called human condition, right? There are universals. Most are associated with the needs that list, okay? And all of us are part of this global human culture trying to understand one another, right? For instance, food being the number one basic need is also super important to when you are going to another culture, and if you are going to be studying that culture, you better eat their food. And I don't mean that as kind of some pedantic, paternal kind of idea. If you show up and somebody offers you their traditional food, whatever that be, if you deny it and say no, you've lost all trust, right? A lot of times, trust and food are so built and ingrained into us that we don't even think about them as important or valuable, okay? Applied anthropology careers, I kind of put a list of careers here: corporate culture, software usability, military liaison, foreign service, government work, cultural resource management, historic preservation. These are all jobs that you can get inside the anthropology world in terms of applicability. And that is it for week one's lesson. Thanks. And again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to chat or feel free to email me. We need to get all these things kind of covered and out of the way.